Yeah, we've got Commissioner Polson on Zoom tonight, and then we may have our youth city council member joining on Zoom as well.
Awesome.
But we'll just turn it over to you, Chair.
Okay. Welcome everyone to the November 6th, 2024 Planning Commission work session. We'll start out with reviewing a couple of business items that for discussion in the business session. One about some zoning update language, specifically and about Wasatch Boulevard Master Plan. And then in the business meeting, we'll talk about consent agenda. So with that, I will turn it over to Sam.
Yeah, so per usual with these kind of code maintenance efforts, Ian and I just kind of do them together. So I'm gonna walk us through the first couple, and then Ian will take it from there. So I'll share my screen and I'm just gonna pull up the memo from your packet. And we'll look at it that way. And let me see if I can clear off some of this extra stuff. Okay. So the first one is codifying the city's existing procedure for something called height verification. So this doesn't make any changes to what the maximum building height is. This doesn't make any changes to how building height is measured. All this edit does is put in item 4, which just codifies what we do at inspections to verify height. So to put it in kind of, less legalese terms, if a building during its permit review is found to be close to the maximum height allowed, we usually flag it and say height verification is needed during inspections. And that is to make sure that when the thing is actually built, it stays below the maximum height. So most of the city, the maximum building height for a home would be 35 feet. It's different if you're on a hillside, that would be 30 feet. But for the sake of this, let's just say we're looking at a house where the maximum is 35 feet. If their permit comes in and it shows that it's 31 feet, we would flag it and say, okay, they need to do height verification of their 4-way inspection. If it's within 1 foot of the maximum, so let's say it's 34 feet when we measure it, we say you need to do height verification at foundation and at 4-way. And the process with that is that they have a licensed Utah surveyor come out and provide us with a certificate that says, I've measured the existing grade and I've measured what's been constructed so far, what's been framed so far. And this is still in compliance and on track to be the height it said it was going to be. So it's been very successful. We've done it for many, many years, but it just wasn't in our code. And so it's helpful when we can actually put things in code and point people to that when we tell them they need to do height verification. Are there questions from the commission on this edit?
Say again, who is it that comes out to verify?
Yeah, so they hire a licensed Utah surveyor. So it's not a member of staff. They need to have a surveyor come out and do it. I would imagine some folks will use the surveyor who did their plans and just have the same firm do it. Doesn't have to be, they just have to be licensed in the state.
I'm just curious, what is the expense associated with
I'm
that?
not sure. I will say anecdotally, I've never had like a lot of grievance aired about it. It's been accepted and kind of
Not a big deal.
not a big deal, but I haven't personally had to do this on something I built, so I'm not sure.
We've had, on very rare occasion, but a few houses that were, before this policy was in place, were not built to plan. We had to verify after the fact. It became an enforcement issue, and a house peak became like a gabled roof. I would imagine that expense is quite a bit greater than just do a quick survey, get it right, and we can move on. So we're trying to just make sure here that the policy that we've been operating under to make sure that our building heights compliant with what is represented on plans, end up that way in the future.
When the applicant comes in and you see that, you tell them that,
Yeah.
I mean, so it's not a surprise.
If they're reading their plans, it's not. So we put a note on the cover of their plans, and then we also put a flag on our permitting software. So when they go to schedule foundation or 4-way inspection, they are notified. Hey, if you look on your approved plans on the cover sheet, there's this note. I think our staff could also facilitate, like when their permit's issued, just reminding them of that. It's not all that often this happens. Yeah, the information is given.
So it's not a surprise.
If
I mean,
people
it's
read
not,
their-
right, I mean, it's there,
Yeah, for sure.
right, okay.
Is this off of natural grade
Off of
or
existing grade.
existing, which existing grade?
It's off the grade before they start their grading for their permit.
Okay,
So that's how we measure height, would be from either approved subdivision grade, if it's part of a subdivision, that's kind of like a different kit and caboodle. But if it's just like a one-off lot, what we do is when they pull their permit, we say, you need to show us what the ground is out there today at each corner of where your house is gonna be. And then you need to show us what the highest roof point of that house is gonna be. We take an average of all four corners, we measure from there. So, I have not, obviously I'm not a surveyor, I haven't performed this, but my understanding is the surveyors acknowledging what the existing grade was and then looking at what's being constructed just to make sure it's on par with what they put in their plans.
Those are actual elevation,
Mhm.
4,523 or whatever. It's, elevation specific measurements.
Actually, the contours.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so they can verify that as well, because obviously, once you start development, the existing grade changes and is modified. Still, we have on plans those elevation measurements for the foundation and the roof height. So that they can go out and shoot those points and verify, okay, this is what the plan said, this is what's on the ground and all kind of reconcile.
Commissioner Mills, did you have?
Yeah, no, two things. So with the, this process, how many times have we applied this to commercial
That's a great
activities
question.
or like our PDD projects? 'Cause I know that height has been a controversial thing for us
Sure.
with, Canyon Center and also with the gravel rock or,
Gravel pit.
AJ gravel pit, the AJ Rock. And they're just anticipating a little bit, with town center, like just making sure however we codify this. And I don't know if it would be, I don't want to make it so onerous that, something that could be applied to a residential situation. It's a very simple process here. But I do think that we do have some properties, where there's enough elevation changes throughout the city that, and I don't know if maybe that's a separate conversation of height for PDDs or, I don't know. I just,
And as far as like just looking at what's the process we do for verifying the height, not looking at like what the roof height is or even making any adjustments to how height is measured, I would say this process works for either.
Okay.
We don't get a lot of new commercial buildings, so I can't
Yeah.
say that when I was reviewing permits in 2019 that I did this on commercial buildings because
Yeah.
no new ones were built.
yeah,
But if I were reviewing one today and it was commercial and it was within 1 to 5 feet, I would say the same of the maximum. I would say the same process would apply and I think it would function well.
Yeah.
Because the measurement system that's outlined in the existing black text is how we also measure commercial buildings. So this verbiage would work for either.
so in my mind, like if somebody came over the design for a really steep pitched roof where the four corners were, I mean, there are European versions where it almost can eclipse like the height of a floor in terms of the difference from the corners to the center. And again, we're not necessarily in the mode of preserving viewscapes, but our modern mountain hope for kind of a design and feel for town center or for, again, I've been very specific about how we measure that. And then, I'm wondering if there's a more granular way. I appreciate that we're taking it from the contours, but, and maybe it's including the property lines and the verbiage to consider, okay, do we, I just feel like we've been bit a little bit just based on, well, this is what the original grade is. And then there's debate about whose version of what the original grade was. And
Sure,
it's
yeah,
expensive to move dirt.
if
And,
you're wanting to make changes to how height is measured, that's gonna be a separate conversation.
okay,
That's not on the table for tonight. All this does is codify how height is verified during the building process. If the commission gives us direction to look at how we measure height and change that, we certainly can do that, but we're not prepared to talk about that tonight.
and I might encourage us to consider it because we are gonna codify height verification procedures rather than just it being a staff function.
Yeah, height measurement would, if we're changing that, that would need, you could recommend that, that would need to come from council.
Okay,
That'd be legislative direction.
What would be
Definitely a
the-
big implication.
what would be the best way to communicate that?
I would recommend letting your council member know.
Okay,
Same
I'm
thing I
happy. I
recommend
will
to
have, I
everybody.
just want to, I don't want to circumvent you guys.
No, not at all.
I'm happy I've got a direct line to any one of those guys,
I will
so.
say though, just so you have context here,
Yes,
it's a little
please,
outside the
please.
scope of this particular amendment. To verify building height, there's numerous checkpoints of, if someone's doing a subdivision, we have, there's site surveys, you're establishing a grading plan, you're establishing all these measurements. So we have that level. Then when a building permit's submitted, you have a site-specific survey with an civil engineer stamp on it that again has those elevation points. They're stamped and certified by a licensed engineer. If it's then within 5 feet of the max, then there's a third level to it where on site as you're building it, you again send a surveyor out to go verify the heights. We understand height is a sensitive issue. It's the subject of a lot of phone calls we get. So we have this, this redundant approach to making sure we are verifying in numerous different ways that a certified professional has looked at and verified building height. So we do have checks in place to make sure, it's not an architect's drawing that makes assumptions for where contour elevations are at the plan level. It's a civil engineer's survey grade site plan that we're signing off on with elevation points so that there's as few surprises as possible along the way.
Is there a current permit if you're going to be doing any cut on vacant lot or fill on vacant lot and compaction for a owner to apply for? Just because, going to Commissioner Mills' point, if that's ever relative, at the end of the day, it's natural grade at that point.
Sure.
So what is that natural grade, and is it legal? Is it compacted appropriately? Was there geotechnical on it? But
Yeah, agree.
is there requirements right now, if anybody's adding a certain amount of fill or doing a certain amount of cut, for us to permit that?
Not if it's not in a sensitive land zone. So if it's in the sensitive lands overlay zone, to do any grading or scoping or to move stuff around, you do have to get a approval to do that. If it's not in that zone, the engineering department does not have a permit requirement. So yeah, it definitely, I think if you guys want to go down the avenue of kind of reassessing that, we're happy to. It's just that's not what this one is tonight.
Got it.
So I want to make sure it's very clear for anyone listening. We're not proposing any changes to what the maximum height is that's allowed. And we're not proposing any changes tonight to how height is measured. We're just codifying the surveying for the definition.
So this is redundancy plan just to ensure what was originally proposed is
Yeah.
what's been
and
built.
It's again,
Yeah.
what we do today, it's just a fair point people will make is like, well, where is that in code that I have to do this?
Yeah.
And so we like to cover that by saying, here it is.
So just so I can better understand, you brought up, there's been issues in the past based on existing grade.
Yeah, it's always a conversation. And so I just want to make sure that it protects the city, that everybody's clear on what the expectation is. And so it is a deeper dive than today's conversation. I get that. But I do think I'll engage the city council because I do think that, as we go forward, there are all sorts of different shaped roofs that effectively at the highest point can be dramatically different if the average gets to a particular point. And if you're playing to the average, you can do all sorts of creative things that will
It
help you
isn't-
if you got 4 points.
It isn't the average of the roof, though. It's the highest point of the roof. At its very tippy point. It's the average of the grade.
But for the height measurement taken by average vertical distance measured at 4 corners.
As
On-
we
on
take
the
the
ground.
average grade of the 4 corners, and then we go to the very top of the roof, whatever the very highest point of the roof is.
To the highest point.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
all
if
right.
there was
Thank
like
you for
a
that.
steeple
Got
in a
it.
building.
Yeah.
We're not saying what's the average of your roof. We're saying what's your very, very like tippy top point.
Mhm.
That is what you're measuring to, even if it is a tiny little thing.
Yeah.
So
Is that
that is in there.
like antennas? I mean, rooftop, whatever. I mean, how
There's
are,
a few exceptions, rooftop appurtenances, are, there's some variation
HVAC.
of exception, chimney flue or HVAC units. Some zones, some commercial zones have exemptions for like mechanical equipment and stuff like that can go above the height limit. It's pretty well prescribed in code right now, though.
Mhm.
But to your point, where we see that, there are a lot of cities that measure to the midpoint of a pitched roof.
Mhm.
It's a very residential development pattern, right? It's a pitched roof.
Absolutely.
But yeah, right now, to the top is the peak of that pitch is the upper height limit. So if you're doing a flat roof, you could have a lot more building there underneath that 35 feet than if you have a 512 pitched roof. We're counting that, whether it's, the highest point is the whole plane of the top of the ceiling or a steeple. That's the highest point. It doesn't go above that.
I think that's great. Thank
Just
you for
keep
that.
us posted if there's a direction the
Yeah.
council wants us.
If there,
to
yeah,
look in.
I'll check in with you guys to see where the conversation goes. And I will represent as only my feelings and just asking the question. So thank you for the little sideshow there.
For sure, yeah, no, great questions, and just naturally, when we talk about height, it opens up a lot of questions, so I think it's a good conversation to have. Were there any other comments or questions on height verification edits? Okay, I'm gonna take us to structure regulations next, and this one admittedly is kind of big, like just long. So as some background for these changes, there was two things that happened. Some legislation was passed in the 2024 state session, Utah legislative session, that basically said you can't require a rear setback, or a rear setback doesn't apply to a couple different things. And one of those things is what state code calls an uncovered landing or a walkout porch no more than 32 square feet. It's very specific. My understanding with this, and this is just kind of what I heard as this was being run in the session, was that builders like to have, and there is some good affordability merit to having like a plan, kind of a pre-done card file plan that can be used multiple times rather than a custom home each time. But where some jurisdictions measure rear setbacks with landings included and others don't, I think that maybe was creating some issues. Again, that's just what I was kind of told, but neither here nor there, it passed in the session, so we'd have to update our code to specify that these things can be in the rear setback. The setback does not apply to them. So we just took the same language that was in code, and we had this existing part of our code that said basically like these things are exempt from setbacks, and that's what's in the black. So we just added 5 to comply with state code to say, yeah, these uncovered landings and these uncovered walkout porches, no more than 32 square feet, are not subject to rear setback. So that's the first change that's in there. And then we also had a review and an opinion issued by the state ombudsman of property rights for a deck reconstruction project in Cottonwood Heights. And from the verdict of that review, we needed to make some changes in our code to be more consistent with how we use the term building versus structure. So our setbacks throughout our zones were listed as buildings, i.e. the setbacks for main buildings are as follows. The setbacks for accessory buildings are as follows. We have always interpreted that here in Cottonwood Heights as also applying to things like a deck. The deck's attached to the home. The setbacks for the home apply to the deck. If the deck is detached, the setbacks for the accessory building apply to that. However, the deck is not a building, it is a structure. And so this created this need for this ombudsman opinion to clarify what applies here. So in response to that, we have made some changes in the code to use the terminology of buildings anywhere where we were currently regulating it as a building, but stating it as a structure. So it's very tedious. We went through and tried to make all these changes, but the effect ultimately is to try to make it more clear and also give greater legal basis for saying, yeah, these things need to meet the same setbacks as a building. There's actually not a change to how things have been reviewed or done. We're just trying to make our code more effective. So there's those changes. And then the last thing that's in here, and I'm so sorry, this one was so long.
Can I go back and ask a question about
For sure,
deck?
yeah,
About deck definition?
sure.
The measurement of it, I get, is from grade, right? Isn't that
Yeah.
what it says? Is the 18 inches only to where you walk on it
Yeah, it's
and
the
not the
platform.
railing, right? Okay.
Yep, it's the platform. And that one was, I believe, copied from state code as well.
18 inches above 18 inches triggers a need for handrails and steps and other building code
Okay.
elements, so anything under that.
And we don't care if there's, and we don't measure, include in the measurement, the railing. That's, no, it's just the platform. Or-
Yeah.
There were also, as you're looking through this, there were like domino effect changes to the numbering of other definitions. So if you're like, why was she changing the definition for a weapon and a wrecking yard? I wasn't. It's just the numbering. But then the final change I wanted to bring up was that while I was in here trying to make these consistency changes, I did notice that we had different terminology for what we consider to be like a main or a primary building. So some of our chapters called it a main building. Other chapters called it a dwelling. Other chapters called it like a structure for human habitation, all meaning the home. And so to be consistent, we just changed all of that to be primary building, and made that cleanup. So that's also some of the length on this one. Yeah, that's the background on why these changes were put in. Do you guys have questions on this one?
Makes sense.
Sounds pretty serious.
It was seriously time consuming to.
Well, it's important because the ombudsman's ruling, basically, decks exist in this no man's land.
Purgatory.
We really can't regulate anything on them right now because of these technicalities in how we refer to things, so. Yeah. A lot of tedious cleanup, but, allows us to actually implement the setbacks that are intended. It's good.
Hey, great, and then let me scroll and scroll and scroll. So many here. But good, it's good changes. Okay, so the next one is about corner lot setbacks. So when you have a corner lot, meaning it's not sandwiched between two other building lots, it's got a street frontage on its front and it's got a street on its side. That side setback that's adjacent to the street is typically larger. Whereas an interior lot can be a little closer to its neighbors. If you've got a corner lot, that side setback is typically bigger. And we've always approved and reviewed building permits that way, but the code technically was reading that larger 20-foot setback should be on both sides of a corner lot, the interior side and the street side. We never interpreted it that way. We never made people do 20 feet on both sides because that wasn't the intention. But obviously the letter of the law was saying that. So we've just updated this to clarify that the 20-foot side setback is for when you're against the street, and the interior setback is on that interior side. So I can pull up like a corner lot on the map if we want to look at it and kind of show you, but you guys have questions?
No, my only question on this was I noticed for the different zones, it's different.
Yeah,
And that's based on the, whether it's low density.
Yeah.
Medium density,
Yeah,
right?
so-
that-
I didn't make any changes to the actual number
No, I was
of
just
what the
curious.
setback was, but yes, the setbacks on like a rural residential lot are going to be bigger than on a standard R1 lot or a multifamily lot. Yeah, correct. Any other questions? Okay. Let's keep scrolling. Okay, my last one, then you get to hear from Ian. We have our architectural review commission. They are wonderful. We have them review architectural edits and site edits for properties that are located in our Gateway Overlay District. This district is like on Fort Union, part of it extends up Highland. And it's just intended to kind of be like a gateway to the city and have stricter architectural controls. Technically, the way our code was written, it was like any project in that needs to go to the ARC. However, in a former legislative session, there was state code passed that said you can't regulate the architecture of 1 and 2 family dwellings. There were some exceptions for if it's like a flood insurance matter, if it's on the historic register, I think. I mean, we would defer to state code on those things if this came up, but we needed to put in our code that we can't regulate architecture on these things. And we haven't been ever since that passed, but needed to spell that out. So this change was made, or is proposed to be made. Any questions? Hey, I get to take a deep breath.
Yay.
And do you want to just use my computer?
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm actually gonna go grab my water, so I'm gonna turn it over to Ian, and I got the mouse tonight.
It's good.
I will be right back.
Okay, so for flag lot drive approaches, staff's our procedure that we followed is we've typically not required a minimum 5 foot approach distance on flag lot drive approaches. That conflicts with typical road standards that are found in Title 14. So we're proposing a codification in Titles 12 and 14 where this is addressed, that flag lots are exempt from that 5 foot approach distance from property lines. And it's just kind of found there in Title 12. There's just a lot of text because this section is huge. Just right here, the driver approach for a private lane is not subject to a minimum distance from property lines, so that gets rid of that 5 foot requirement. For flag lots, which are defined in Title 12, and then for Title 14, where the 5 foot approach distance is also mentioned, we're just adding in exceptions for flag lot, private lane drive approaches. If there's any questions on this one?
I should know this, but define what a flag lot is.
So it's shaped like a flag. Typically what will happen, if I could draw it, it'd be easier, but basically you'll have just a standard lot in front, and then you'll have a lot that's shaped like a flag where the driveway comes out of the road, and then most of the lot is behind that front lot. So
Oh,
you've got this kind of stick that's the driveway, and then the house is in the rear with the yard and everything else.
Right.
It's a lot that doesn't have direct frontage on a established public or private street. The only way to get to it is a private driveway. that
yeah, I
kinda
could see
goes in
one
behind.
on my street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We do a lot of mop up on those over the years here, just because some of them that were entitled way back when, and then when somebody makes a change, the ability to try to see if there's something that could be improved in the situation, or, trying to keep people from having non-buildable land or non-buildable properties. And sometimes it's like you're trying to. cut
So
something.
before you move on,
Mhm.
when do you see this not being applicable? Because I would imagine that anytime that there's a flag lot created, it will require a private lane
Mhm.
every time, so do we have to define except in that, or should it just be there's no 5 foot requirement at all?
I think that we've enforced that 5 foot rule for other drive approaches where you have interior lots.
Yeah.
But we haven't enforced it for flag lots, so that's why we're proposing that distinction.
So if you have a standard residential lot that fronts on a public street, the driveway, the approach has to be 5 feet off property lines. Just a little bit of separation, typically because that driveway will have a flare out in the public right of way. And if you're right on the property line and you build a flare, then your flare's going over into your neighbor's property.
No, understood, but I think this is
But-
specifically on flag
We're
lots.
saying on flag lots, it's typically not a conventional driveway, it's just an alleyway access that leads to a back lot. They're called, private driveways, but they're treated a little bit differently because they're access roads back to a back lot. So
But there's still gonna be a turning radius that they're gonna need to come out, because they're going to be turning on the oncoming, or, they're gonna.
Yeah, so if they're proposing, they just can't, if they're proposing,
Can't flare.
they couldn't flare if they were proposing one that's closer than 5 feet from the property line. There's also a standard in the flag lot ordinance that requires a landscape buffer on the outside of that flag lot driveway. Typically, I think 4 feet in width, so that inherently creates a bit of a buffer and a little bit of a room for a flare, because a driveway is not pushed right up against the property line, it's offset by a 4 foot landscape buffer.
That answers the question. I think the accept is just, it's always going to be private if it's a flag lot, if I understand correctly.
How do you mean? Like
Isn't
the-
it, isn't it
Yeah,
always going to be
yeah,
a private road?
access is, for a flag lot access is always private, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yes,
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah.
flag lot, private land. Yeah,
Is there anything, just as we're helping somebody create this access into a property? Obviously, just prohibiting or giving them some leeway here to not have to go the full length. Is there any benefit to putting a minimum on it to say, listen, to Sean's point, that Commissioner Simon's point, that getting in and out is still gonna be tricky if there's nothing? Is there any benefit to a minimum or are we over prescribing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a minimum just inherent because of the landscape buffer.
Landscape.
There's a 4 foot minimum as it is today.
Mhm.
But on a plat, that 4 foot landscape buffer looks like part of the private lane.
Hmm.
So we think that's adequate to, answer any of these questions or these logistical challenges that we have. We're not changing that. That's in every private flag lot access is you have a 4 foot landscape buffer before the actual driveway can start on the property.
So what stemmed this was just like, well, we're only requiring 4 feet. We can't make them go 5.
Do we have to
Yeah.
require another
Doesn't
5
make
on top of
sense.
the 4?
Yeah.
And then what do you do with
Yeah,
that?
You
that
were
totally
maybe
makes sense.
reviewing a flag lot, or
Mhm.
someone came to us and
This-
we look at the curb cut or the drive approach, and so does Public Works, and it was like, well, this meets flag lot standards, but we have this thing that says
Yeah.
they have to be 5 feet, it's already 4 feet.
And I wasn't aware we didn't enforce that for flag lots too, so then I came up with this.
Yeah,
That's a great housekeeping item.
Yeah.
thank you, we love houses.
Do you guys have any other questions on this or comments? Okay. Move on to ADU application expirations. So right now, something that we struggle with with ADU applications is there's a high level of dormancy with them. Typically, what will happen is we will review ADU applications and give an initial planning approval just to make sure that they conform to our ADU codes. And then we typically send the applicants off to complete a building permit, business licensure, which is required before they get full ADU licensure. What we have experienced with quite a few applications is that we attempt to notify applicants that this is the next step. They don't apply for the building permits and then it just kind of sits there in no man's land. And we try to get in touch with them repeatedly and they just don't respond. So we just have a bunch of ADU applications sitting dormant. Not a terrible amount, but it's there and we've noticed it.
Yeah, that's a good.
So we're just proposing in addition to our ADU code in Title 19 that would cause ADU applications to expire after 6 months of dormancy from the most recent application step. So whether, I think we chose that wording step so that it's a bit more broad, but yeah, essentially so that if something's just sitting vacant, we can kind of put a time limit on it.
So the example there would be, let's say we look at all the planning criteria and say, yeah, you're good, it meets planning, then go get a building permit to either do the construction you need to do or to do a walkthrough inspection of what you've already done. And then they would have 6 months to do that. And then if they do that within the 6 months, they're good. They have 6 months to do the next thing. We're just trying to keep them moving, both to kind of get them all the way through and also because it can be challenging if codes change. And if we make an update to an ADU code and we have these ones that are kind of like, they've applied, they're trapped in there in the middle, a code since changed over, what are they subject to?
For example, I have an application that's been sitting vacant for almost 2 years because there's just no success in getting in touch with the applicant. So this would help remedy that.
Maybe a little incentive to
Do
keep.
we have the same umbrella for single family dwellings as well, or is this just?
Building permits
Yeah.
are subject to this right now.
Yeah,
Building permits,
so
but not applications for permits?
not applications, not the,
For building, not for land use applications, for building permits, whether it's commercial, residential, anything in between, it's 6 months between
I think
action.
Sean's asking though, or Commissioner Simon's asking though, like during the review process for the building permit, we don't have that today. So somebody could say, hey, you gave me my corrections in July. My permit's not issued yet. I'm resubmitting plans in January. I believe if a building code cycle has changed, they may be subject to the new code cycle, but candidly, that doesn't happen a ton. There's usually a lot of motivation to finish the building permit, so. Does that answer?
Yeah.
What you're getting at?
What percentage of applicants are letting this sit as far as? Anytime that we put a timeline on this, like, it just concerns me that it's,
Sure,
preventing, I mean, what if somebody is getting bids or
Well, we've
going
tried
through that
to,
process?
yeah, we try to keep it kind of broad by saying subsequent steps. So that doesn't necessarily mean like a full resubmission of plans. It could just be like, hey, I'm just wanting to make sure this application continues. I'm just giving an anecdotal example, but that's one of the reasons we try to keep that wording broad.
yeah, I would say we probably have. I don't know, maybe 20% of them kind of stall out and are just hanging out in there, and it can be. We also have concern that people may just like start running the ADU without fully finishing out the inspection of the property. and everything, and we can't just go do that unless they get a permit and request the
I
inspection.
think that happens often where you have like a basement apartment that's already finished. And they've been told that they need the SADI application and they go through the planning process, and even though we've tried to be very clear that planning review is not the full permit. They're just kind of like, well,
I got the,
I'm already operating this, I've got. the plan,
yeah, so we'd
finish it."
like people to finish it out for a lot of reasons, one of them being like life safety, making sure smoke detectors are in and handrails and egress, so. We just chose 6 months because that's what the building permit inspection things are, but if y'all feel like there's a more appropriate interval, totally up for discussion.
Is there anything in state code about it? Because I know ADUs were such a focus.
Not that I'm aware of specific to
Okay.
ADUs, there is verbiage in state code about plan review in general. And it's, it's very, very dense. I would have to like pull it up and read it, but there are some things in there, to Sean's point, about just like standard building permits. Where it says if an applicant takes X amount of time to resubmit, basically the clock starts over with how many review cycles a city can take. I think the idea there is like, if you're resubmitting a year later, it's basically a brand new review because it's been so long. But no, I'm not aware of anything specific to ADUs.
It is in building code, International Building Code. Pull it up, has a standard of work must be commenced within 180 days after issuing a permit.
So what even,
That's great.
So this is even a little more lenient than the
Yeah.
building
right,
code
right.
side of it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks for checking that.
So if someone contacts you at 7 months, they've been sitting around not doing anything for 7 months, do they go back to the beginning of the process?
Yeah, we would have them reapply. I mean, I think that's a good discussion point too, is there like, for permits, we allow them to do a reinstatement fee where they don't have to start all the way over, they just have to reinstate the permit, and it's our minimum permit fee of $47.
Yeah.
So
Which-
you guys could think about something like that too. The way this is written, they would have to reapply fully.
And it would have to probably go through another full staff review rather than just picking up where it left off, just in case any codes have changed. So that fee may make sense.
And I'm fine, I mean, I think seems like the right way to proceed with, it's been 6 months, but
Yeah, and we definitely do have a lot of really highly motivated applicants who they do cruise right through the process. They keep us updated, they go through it. It's just, I think my biggest concern is the ones that, from our perspective, are like just dormant, but I'm kind of in the back of my mind going like, you're just probably running this thing. And we haven't even checked if it's.
How many ADUs do we have currently in the city that we've approved since the legislative?
Yeah, great question. So as far as ones that are approved, I'm aware of at least 2 detached ones, so not very many detached because the regulations are quite strict. And then, just like trying to picture my folders, I would guess, let's see, 2021, it's been about 3 years. I would guess between 12 and 15 internal ones, maybe.
Cool.
The city council has expressed some interest in looking again at the detached standards to maybe make that like a more realistic feasibility for more
Yeah.
people. But as it stands today, it's a pretty hard process to get approved for detached.
Do you guys have any other comments on this?
I think clearing those out, I mean, to me, if you have something that's existing and already functioning, I think our legal challenge increases the longer that they have something existing that's not
Yeah.
being regulated. So I share that concern that it's like, listen, let's jump them back into the process for their sake and for our sake. The liability for the property owner, protect the property owner, protect the city, and keep our process clean. So if you feel like this does that,
I think it's
I like
a good shot. We'll see how it goes and we'll come back to you guys if it's not good.
Okay, this next one's kind of fun, kind of goofy. So you remember back to the early 2000s, bars were not called bars, they were called private clubs or Class D private clubs.
Do you remember that, Ian?
You know, I was a wee little kid in St. George. I don't really
Had to
remember.
ask.
I don't think we had any bars, so no. So these are terms that are still in our code, even though they're not in state code anymore. So we're just proposing to kind of clean that up and remove the term private club from the title. And kind of repurpose that with a new definition of bar establishment, which is what state code references. And then also we're recommending that a modification is made to where bars or private clubs are allowed so that wherever restaurants would be allowed, bar establishments would be allowed either. So I can't recall off the top of my head if this is a permitted use in all the zones where restaurants are allowed, but we're just proposing to kind of keep that in line.
To be clear too, that is how we would review it today, because since Class D private club is a defunct term, if someone were to come in today and say, I want to open a restaurant and I intend to get a liquor license, we would say, okay, so that falls under our restaurant use. You are subject to the state's proximity regulations for liquor licensing, which prevent bars from being within a certain amount of feet from community locations like churches, schools, parks. I'm gonna miss all of them, but some of those, so.
Like public community spaces.
So that doesn't, it's not really a change to how it would be if someone came in today. But it is just kind of trying to make the terminology more current with how licensing is done, so.
So I guess I'll just breeze really quickly through the suggested changes. So the definition of a bar establishment was kind of fused between one that I found from, I think it was Spanish Fork or Springville, but it was pretty up to date. And then we just have some wording in there that references state code, which regulates bar establishments, like Sam just mentioned. Just striking the definition of a private club since that's no longer in use, and then just adding bar establishment to the same use category as a restaurant. So like for mixed use zones, this is restaurants under 25,000 square feet of floor area. It would be a conditional use if it was over 25,000 square feet of floor area. This is a permitted use in the neighborhood commercial zone. And then in the regional commercial zone, it is a conditional use. And I think that's the only zones where a restaurant is mentioned. That's our suggestion. Do you guys have any feedback on that?
Makes sense.
The state regulations are quite strict, so.
Yeah, and those would still be followed, or this wouldn't like supersede that, of course, but yeah. And then I think this is our last one, garages in residential zone, rear setback clause. So right now, our residential zones specify that attached garages are subject to rear yard setback standards, but no other yard setbacks. This has led to some confusion with applicants because it's always been practice for staff to consider any structure attached to a primary structure. So an attached garage to a home, you'd kind of just consider it part of the footprint of the home, maybe not the, the floor area, but part of the footprint of the home. And it's always been our practice to just measure setbacks to anything within the footprint of the home, including a garage. But this sentence specifies that attached garages are subject to rear yard setbacks. It leaves out other setbacks. So we just think that this creates confusion and we're proposing to strike this.
And it did create confusion. We had a contractor, like justifiably so, be very confused, who said,
Yeah.
We said, hey, your plans show this attached garage, it doesn't meet the front yard setback, and it's attached to the home. And he said, well, your code says it's subject to the rear setback. And I meet that. And we were like, oh, it's attached to the building, it has to meet all the building setbacks.
Yeah.
That is confusing. So striking that from the record, I hope will make that more clear.
Yeah. So
Kind of odd.
like in R18, pretty similar for all the residential zones, but like this is how it was worded, where you see the sentence being struck here. You've got the setbacks, the accessory building setbacks, and then attached garages shall conform to the rear yard requirements in main buildings, but it says nothing about side yard setbacks or front yard setbacks. So we're just proposing to strike that because we would consider attached garages to fall under the same restrictions or codes as this first point here about primary structures.
Is this going to create illegal non-conforming structures?
I don't think so, because as far as I'm aware, we've never reviewed permits using this.
But I mean, previous to us establishing Conwood Heights, I mean, I can.
There
I can
are
count-
non-conforming
Yes.
structures everywhere in the city.
Yeah.
Will it be conforming to this code?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I don't believe this has actually any implication on that. We have a lot of them that are non-conforming to side setbacks or front setbacks or rear setbacks for various reasons. We consider them to be legal because when they were built, they met the setback, but to my knowledge, this does not have a heavy bearing on it.
And I'm not really sure what the purpose of the sentence was to have in code.
Okay,
Beginning
so
of
if somebody, had built their building back in 1999, it burns down. they go and try to build that same footprint, you don't see any implications for that.
They are able to do that by our
Yeah.
code.
They can do that no matter what, yeah.
Yeah, they can
We
just-
don't believe that like the regulation is even changing by removing this. It just kind of clears up.
Yeah.
what this means.
Yeah, someone can just do it 1-to-1 if if act of God.
Yeah.
That's what our code says.
Public enemy.
So I think that's our last one, right? And I do want to leave you a bit of time if it's okay with the chair. Were there any other questions about our housekeeping?
No, it's great. I appreciate the work and
Great.
getting the clarifications done. No, it's not always.
It's satisfying.
All
It does it. Okay, that's it for Max and then.
Okay, I'll be fairly quick here and we can talk more if there's questions in the business meeting. This is a proposal directed by the city council at its 2024 council retreat to amend very limited portion of the Wasatch Boulevard master plan. That's an area master plan that was adopted by the city council in 2019. It looks at transportation, land use, and kind of the future vision of the Wasatch Boulevard corridor and surrounding area. There are 3 very specific areas where the council unanimously agreed to modify. I call these minor, kind of technical modifications to better clarify, the city's original and continual intent as it makes recommendations on Wasatch Boulevard itself. Obviously, this is a state road that we're talking about, so this becomes language that's used as we work with Department of Transportation. So the first proposed amendment is found in 2 locations in the plan, one being the executive summary and then one being the actual body of the plan where this diagram lives. And it's just as it relates to the preferred cross section that came out of the Wasatch Boulevard master plan process. The plan recommended that UDOT implement a flex shoulder concept with any roadway widening. So that additional roadway capacity prioritized in the original plan, vehicles in peak hours, public transportation, or HOVs, so multiple people in one vehicle, and wasn't open to just single occupant vehicles. It was transit prioritized. And then in off hours, it was, just unused active transportation, bike lane, that kind of. The proposed amendment here, again, based on the clear direction from the council, was to eliminate the recommendation that ever be open to standard vehicular traffic, and that is a transit only lane. And I feel like that is supported throughout the plan of, we say continuously in this plan, we want to add capacity in a cautious manner and in a way that is transit supportive, because this plan views transit as ultimately the best solution to reduce congestion on. That's number 1. You can see the original description above. We're changing a few lines here and there. We're striking vehicles in peak hours, open to HOVs on peak ski days, and just saying it's open to transit during peak hours, informal active transportation space the rest of it. You may, yeah.
Who determines peak? How is peak hours determined?
Typically comes about as part of traffic studies. They'll go out and do traffic studies.
And
UDOT
say
would
it's
do
typically
a
these
traffic
hours.
analysis before they do any capacity widening or study. And they would determine as part of that what peak days and peak hours are on that.
And then would there be signage? Because I know in other
Yeah.
areas where
Yeah.
they have these kind of.
How you implement it, yeah, it's not, this is a master plan level
Sure.
document, so it's making
Yeah.
recommendations. Certainly, there's some logistics to how you communicate that.
They'd have to either like stripe the lane to say like bus only or do like overhead signage. Yeah, for sure. I'm sure that will be an important piece of anything there.
Amendment number 2 is along the same exact lines. You can see, again, it's in the executive summary and in the body of the plan. It's the same change, just the written portion of this. There's a recommendation, finding under this goal of the plan to promote and prioritize sustainable solutions to Wasatch Canyon access at a local and regional scale. This is the bullet point that basically explains what that graphic shows: is implement a flex shoulder on Wasatch Boulevard south of Bengal, open to transit and HOVs only on peak ski days. We are amending that to delete HOVs and saying peak hours instead of peak ski days. So that only in the most congested traffic hours is that open to transit.
Maybe I am misremembering how I read this. Is it always south of Bengal? For some reason, I thought
So-
it was south of Fort Union.
So-
Someplace.
Yeah, practically it is, but this is related to adding capacity. North of Bengal Boulevard, the roadway is already 2 lanes in each
Oh, I see.
direction, and then it narrows down at Bengal. That's why this plan says south of Bengal. Certainly, the intention would be to implement any transit solution with pickup as soon as you reach that section of the corridor. But that's why it's written south of Bengal, because that's where the road would be widened from where it is today.
Okay.
North of that, it's already a 5-lane cross section. The third one, again, very similar. There's a recommendation that justifies these findings within the body of the plan. There's a paragraph that says, strongly consider using flex shoulders with future consideration for dedicated bus lanes. And then the description there, again, same thing, references that shoulder would be open to all vehicles in peak hours in each of these transit on ski days. We have struck out all vehicles in peak hours and HOVs so that it's open to transit on during peak hours. That is the extent of the plan. This was the council had, there have been numerous work sessions where this topic came up. Where they landed in unanimous agreement at the council retreat was, we are not opening up this entire plan for amendment. We're only looking at these specific sections. This was presented, these changes were presented by Councilmember Burrell in that work session and got buy-in, support from the other 4 council members. But that's, following that directly and proposing this.
Is there safety concern? Because if you're using, let's just say, bus transit on Monday through Friday, and somebody's biking there on a Saturday and then they're biking there again and they don't necessarily understand the difference. I mean, the mixes don't seem congruent necessarily. Is there concern there, or is there any kind of precedent that's been set?
At a master plan level, we're laying out the vision. The implementation is critical, to your point. You have to communicate that very explicitly and very clearly of when it's open to buses and when it's not. And that would require some further coordination if this were ever implemented by UDOT to figure out exactly what that looks like. This plan doesn't go into that detail other than to lay out, hey, this is how we envision this corridor function.
There are some examples that I've seen just by where I live, not this exact situation because I don't live by Wasatch, but where it's like bus only these days and that's striped and signed. And then I think it says like, it may say something like bikes these days or something like that. I imagine they'd have to do something the same, clarify. These days, you're gonna have a bus coming through here and these other days.
But this would be applicable all week long. I mean, because it's also going to address the fact that peak hours could be ski days. I mean, on weekends too, so.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I mean, it's not just going to be the commuting hours.
I think to Mike's point, like the vision is, let's not open up another lane that's just for cars. If we're gonna have widening, it should only be for public transit. And then the implementation is in Google where you have safety studies done, I would imagine, but yeah, good point.
So are we prohibiting bikes on Wasatch Boulevard part of the time?
Just in that lane, right? In that,
I think.
Because that's
I
gonna be a
think-
major concern for a
No, I
lot
don't
of
think
people.
that's accurate either. I
Okay.
think you would have a striped bike lane in there.
Uh-huh,
The actual cross section out there
Yeah.
does have shoulder space.
yeah,
There's room that's not in this, this master plan level cross section. The idea is to have an on-street bike lane, but that bike lane could get bigger.
yeah,
If you've got that barricaded off as a bus lane during certain days, maybe that's a wider. Cyclists are free to veer outside of the
Yeah.
striped, 3-foot bike lane on certain days or hours. Otherwise, they have to stay in that bike lane knowing buses may also. be in that.
and it makes a lot of sense to me that if the buses are sharing with the bikes and the bikes know that, okay, when buses are coming through, yield to the buses, and also the bus drivers know that, okay, I'm getting into an area where I might see some bikes here, and just being a little patient as the bikes get out of the way.
Yeah,
I mean, there's less brain damage as
Yeah,
a
that'll be
cyclist right on Wasatch Boulevard if you're dealing with vehicles that expect to see you. And even if you have to navigate, it's like, oh, dang it, there's a bus, move over to
Yeah.
the side. But you know, as long as it doesn't it's not an accidental prohibition.
No. The intent is because there's a proposal to have a shared use path separated. But your dedicated cyclists don't want to use a shared
No.
use path and your casual cyclists don't want to use the on-street bike lane. So there is there's value in having both.
Yeah.
That's the intention. Elsewhere in the plan that we don't get into in this amendment, there's language over and over again, and then a subsequent council resolution to in conjunction with this, achieve an updated roadway design that results in a slower speed, which helps with the safety concerns. If you have cars or buses, whatever vehicles going 50 miles an hour next to an on-street bike lane, that's not an ideal situation. So this recommendation is in conjunction with everything else that, in this perfect vision, the roadway would be, redesigned and slowed down and safer for all modes of transportation.
I do want to point out too, I think like without edits, the plan would currently still say this is a flex thing that's open to bikes some days. What it currently says is on the days it's not open to bikes, it's also open to private cars. So the edit is not, oh, this is a flex lane. The edit is the flex lane's only open to transit,
Yeah.
which seems probably better for cyclists, in my opinion. but
Absolutely.
definitely
Guaranteed.
requires some careful implementation.
Yeah. And that extra space just for snow removal, there's some unintended consequences of the positive for UDOT and for the community. If we have a really, really active snowstorm, you look up going up Big and Little Cottonwood Canyon, the fact that on the uphill side going up because they put a bigger shoulder on the uphill side to push the snow onto, it's dramatic how much it buys UDOT with the ability to push snow on those really, really heavy days. So it's, the shoulder is good for them, it's good for us.
Yeah.
Fewer cars that are
Yeah.
parking the soft shoulder and bikes aren't gonna be in on those days.
The overall takeaway, the original intent of the plan, and we don't see that as changing here, is if you're going to add capacity, speaking to UDOT, do it only if needed and do it in a way that prioritizes transit services. Yeah.
Makes sense.
I think, I do also want to note, like, we can talk more about this too in this discussion. I feel that I may have left us in alerts with not enough time in this one, so by all means, in the next one, if you guys want to ask more questions, please do that. We don't need to rush this through by any means.
Sounds good. Let's continue the discussion for this one. It sounds like we could do that. Okay, well, we're at ending time for the work session.
Closing time.
Do we have
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
okay,
Second.
Commissioner Smith and Commissioner Shelton? Thank you.